Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to your forecasts or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast, that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the upcoming weekend real quick, starting with temperatures up in the Fairbanks area. As we look out starting on Thursday through Monday, we'll see temperatures steadily dropping, especially those lows, as we move in towards the Sunday-Monday time frame, seeing low temps below zero down to as low as -11 on Monday, with the high temperatures only getting up to around 6 degrees. This is going to be true for a lot of the mainland and throughout the interior. This one's just highlighting the Fairbanks area of how cold it's going to get as we move through the weekend and early next week. Taking a look now in the south central area, you can see the map in the bottom right stretching out over much of south central Alaska. The coldest temperatures are going to be in the Copper River Basin, where we will have lows getting down to around -20 for Sunday morning. Other areas around Sunday morning in the single digits for much of the Matanuska and Susitna valleys, and then in the teens for areas on the western part of the Kenai Peninsula and into some areas around Anchorage. Zooming in a little bit, we'll look out over the Anchorage, Seward, and Kenai areas. This is going to stretch instead of just being a single day. Like the last image, this one's going to go through much of the weekend as well. And you can see, as we notice with the Fairbanks area, we are going to see temperatures dropping as we move into the weekend, whereas Thursday morning lows for Anchorage is around 18, for Kenai 17, but as we move into the Sunday time frame for Anchorage, down around 10 degrees and down to as low as 11 for the Kenai area, Seward down to 16, and highs only making it up into the 20s for all of these locations as we move into Sunday time frame. It's going to steadily get colder throughout the next several days. And meanwhile, in southeastern Alaska, we are expecting quite a bit of rain to come. There's going to be periods of heavy rain throughout the weekend. Saturday and Sunday will both see significant rainfalls, multiple inches throughout this time period. That's going to include some of the heaviest rains on Sunday, so be mindful of that. Saturday night will have a lot of rainfall for areas around the southeastern portion of the state, and that's going to be starting on or later on Friday, and then really heavy as we get into Saturday and Sunday time frame. Lows are also going to drop down into the 30s to lower 40s. Taking a look now at satellite imagery, we can start to pick out some of the features that are going to cause this. One of which we have our low pressure system out by the Central Aleutian Islands, bringing in a frontal system into the southern portion of the Bering Sea and rain throughout the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. As we look out further to the east, we have a low coming up towards the Panhandle area, a little bit weaker and staying a little bit further to the south. Not as much of an impact for the Panhandle, with some cloud cover and rain approaching the southern portion of the Panhandle. Up in the Arctic, we can see some of the snow showers coming in, some of the colder air coming in from the northwest, bringing some snow to areas along the northwest coastline, and some of the elevated surf that we've been continuing to see that's going to last into tomorrow on Friday. We'll still have that elevated surf around the Chukchi Sea coastline with the northwest winds that we're seeing up there. And finally, we can see some of the high pressure out over the area of mainland Alaska, which is going to be one of the reasons why we see some of the colder temperatures out over the weekend as that high pressure starts to make itself more dominant over the area. For our weather for the remainder of the day, our low pressure system out by the Central Aleutians is bringing some heavier rain throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula, as well as some stronger winds to the Aleutian Islands, with that deep low at 968 millibars. So look out further to the east, our low near the Alaska Panhandle is bringing some rain up towards the Panhandle area, but not quite in there. Meanwhile, we have some lingering showers over the central and northern locations, primarily rain at low-lying areas and then snow at some of the higher elevations. We'll also see some snow in the eastern portions of south central Alaska and some areas of fog around the northern Cook Inlet area. Also going to see some snow in the interior, and that's going to extend out towards the west coast from the YK Delta area up the west coastline towards Utqiagvik, where we'll start to see a mix of fog with that snow, and then areas of fog further to the east along the coastline. As we move into tonight with high pressure out over mainland Alaska, we're going to see that fog expanding throughout much of the Arctic coastline into the interior portions of the state as well as down into the YK Delta, and we're also going to have some areas of fog in the northern Cook Inlet area. Meanwhile, up along the Arctic coastline on the northwestern side, we're going to see some snow from the northwest winds that we have coming into the area, and some snow in the eastern portions of the south central area. Down in the Panhandle area, continuing to see some lighter snow are in the higher elevations of the northern portions. Meanwhile, we're going to see some rain at the low-lying areas to include Yakutat and central and northern places of the Panhandle. Our system that's out west is starting to push further to the east, bringing its front further into the Alaska Peninsula and starting to bring some rain to Kodiak Island, as well as the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. Still seeing some stronger winds around this low pressure system as well. As we move into Friday, that front is going to extend out through much of the Gulf now, starting to bring those first rounds of heavier rain towards the Panhandle area. We're going to continue to see multiple lows move through this pattern, bringing more rain off of the Gulf and North Pacific waters into the Panhandle, bringing in that heavier moisture. We're going to see that as mostly rain throughout the Panhandle, with some snow at the higher elevations in the more northern locations. This front also extends through the Kodiak Island area and Alaska Peninsula, bringing more rain to these locations as well. Once again, some snow at some of the higher elevations around these areas. And meanwhile, over mainland Alaska, we still have high pressure out over the interior. We're going to see some snow underneath that for eastern portions of south central Alaska, and then some continued snow along the west coast from the northwest coastline down through the Norton Sound area. Areas of fog also in Norton Sound as well as along the North Slope. Finally, as we move into Saturday, seeing continued snow along the west coast of the state from the Norton Sound area up through the Arctic coastline. And as we have that continued push of that northerly flow, bringing in some of that colder air into mainland Alaska, out around our high pressure that's over northeastern Russia, pulling in that colder air to the state. We're going to see more snow along the Arctic coastline as well as in the Brooks Range and in the interior portions of the state. Meanwhile, we have a low over the northeastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, helping to bring more rain to the Panhandle area and some snow at the higher elevations. And you can see the leading edge of the next system bringing the next round of heavy rain to the Panhandle area, just starting to make its way into areas towards the southern Gulf of Alaska. Out over the Panhandle, or the Alaska Peninsula rather, we have a mixture of rain and snow, with rain at low-lying areas and some more snow at some of the higher elevations. Then out over the western Aleutian Islands, we're going to see some rain from another system coming up, bringing in an influx of moisture from those southerly winds. Taking a look at our temperatures, our lows for Friday morning out over the Aleutian Islands area dropping down to around 40 degrees. Out over southwest Alaska, temperatures near the coastline going to drop down into the 20s, but further inland we are expecting those to stay in the teens. As we move further east in the interior, we are expecting temperatures to go down into the single digits and eventually below zero, especially for northern locations of the interior, to include Bettles, Fort Yukon, and up in the Arctic Village area, getting down to minus 12, coldest in the state Friday morning. Along much of the west coast of the state and Seward Peninsula area, dropping down into the mid-20s, lower 20s the northwest coastline, and single digits for the eastern portions of the Arctic coast. Down in south central Alaska, teens in interior locations and 20s as we get closer towards the Gulf waters, and then in the mid-30s for much of the Panhandle area. Friday afternoon highs getting up into the lower to mid-40s for the most part, a little bit warmer in the more southern locations. And then in south central Alaska, temperatures getting up into the 30s near the water and in the 20s in interior locations. Getting up into the teens for most of the interior and western places of the interior as well as the west coast into the 20s, with 30s right along the water's edge. Up along the Arctic coastline getting into the 20s, a little bit colder out east. And then down in the Aleutian Islands getting up into the mid-40s. Saturday morning dropping back down into the mid-30s, with mid-30s for the Pribilof Islands as well. 20s along the southwest coastline and the west coast of the Seward Peninsula, but once again getting into the teens as we push further inland and eventually single digits and below zero for the eastern and central portions of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, down into the teens along the western areas, single digits out east. Down in south central Alaska, most places getting down into the teens, however, Cup River Basin getting below zero. And then down in the Panhandle area, northern locations getting down into the 30s, and then right around 40 for southern locations. Saturday afternoon highs going to get up into the 50s for southern locations of the Panhandle, into the 40s elsewhere. And then in the south central area, 30s along the coastline with 20s in the more interior locations, still colder in the Copper River Basin, single digits there. Single digits for the eastern and northern locations of the interior, progressively getting warmer as we move further to the west, getting into the 20s eventually, and then 30s right along the coastline. Up along the Arctic coast, western locations getting up into the mid-20s and mid-teens for eastern locations. Down in the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands getting up into the lower 40s, with right around 40 degrees expected for the Pribilof Islands, with St. Paul at 39 degrees.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Friday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we do have some MVFR conditions with some areas of IFR where our front's moving through the eastern and central Aleutian Islands. Out over southwest Alaska and south central Alaska, VFR conditions are expected till we get into the Wrangell-St. Elias area where we'll start to drop down towards IFR. In the interior, a mixture of MVFR and IFR is expected, and that's going to extend out west towards the Kotzebue Sound area and up along the Arctic coast as well. In the Panhandle area, southern locations expected to stay VFR, however northern locations will be MVFR and eventually IFR as we get closer towards Haines and Skagway. Friday afternoon, things going to be primarily MVFR for the Panhandle area, VFR for south central and southwest Alaska, MVFR through much of the interior and along the Arctic coastline and the west coast through the Kotzebue Sound and Norton Sound areas. Out over the Bering Sea, primarily MVFR conditions as well as for the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula with an area of IFR down by the peninsula. On Saturday morning, primarily MVFR conditions for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. However, there will be some pockets of VFR conditions out by the Pribilof Islands. VFR conditions expected for the southern mainland, and then MVFR conditions once we get into the interior and along the Arctic coastline with some areas of IFR in the central Brooks Range. Down in the Panhandle area, southern locations will see MVFR conditions, but then IFR conditions for central and northern locations to include Yakutat. Saturday afternoon, primarily IFR conditions spreading throughout the Panhandle area. However, in south central Alaska and southwest, primarily VFR conditions expected, some MVFR conditions in the interior, and then mixture of MVFR and IFR for the Arctic coastline. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, western locations, we'll see some MVFR conditions. Those will be creeping into the central locations such as the Pribilofs as well, but then some VFR conditions for the central and eastern Aleutians as well as eastern portions of the Bering Sea. Taking a look at the passes, AKwx should be MVFR throughout the day on Friday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill should be VFR throughout the day Friday, as well as Rainy Pass. Windy Pass will start off with marginal conditions and then improve to VFR in the afternoon, as well as at Isabel Pass. Mentasta also starting off marginal, improving to VFR conditions. Tanita should be VFR throughout the day Friday, as well as at Portage. And then Chilkoot and White will both start off IFR and then improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. For our freezing levels, our surface freezing line moves through the northern portions of the Bering Sea, then down towards Bristol Bay area, rides along the North Gulf Coast, and then out through the Panhandle. We have some warmer air by the Alaska Peninsula, with heights up to as high as 6,000 feet just to the south of the peninsula. For our icing up along the northwest coastline, we do expect some icing below 8,000 feet. For the central and western Aleutian Islands, above 4,000 feet, and also above 4,000 feet as we approach the Kodiak Island area, and then between 2,000 and 7,000 feet over the Panhandle. For our jet stream, our strongest portion of the jet is going to be out over the Gulf of Alaska out of a westerly direction up to as high as 125 knots, dropping down to around 110 knots out over the Panhandle area, 105 knots over the North Gulf Coast. Out over the west coast of the state, northwesterly winds 75 to 85 knots is expected. Circulation around our low for the central Aleutian Islands is going to be out of a northeasterly direction, around 50 knots, and then some winds as high as 85 knots out of the northwest, just to the south of the western Aleutian Islands. Moving down to 9,000 feet, some of our strongest winds are going to be around our low near the eastern Aleutians. Out over the southern portions of the Bering Sea, easterly winds are expected up to as high as 55 knots, but dropping down as we get by the Aleutians, closer towards 40 or 45. Out over the northern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, westerly winds up to as high as 55 knots, and then down around 40 knots as we move through the Barren Islands area, and between 35 and 45 knots out of a northwesterly direction for the Panhandle. Along the west coast of the state, we'll see some stronger northerly winds, 30 knots over the YK Delta area, and 35 knots out over the northwest coastline. Looking down at 3,000 feet, once again our strongest winds are going to be around our low by the eastern Aleutian Islands. Winds up to as high as 65 knots out of the east for the southern Bering, coming into around 55 knots for the central Aleutian Islands, dropping down to 30 knots by the western Aleutians. Out over the Bristol Bay area, see winds up around 50 knots out of the easterly direction, and then some winds out of a northerly direction for Cook Inlet area around 30 knots. For the Gulf waters just near the Panhandle area, we're going to look at northwesterly winds at 35 knots there. And then some more winds up along the northwest coastline out of a northwesterly direction up to as high as 35 knots. Several areas of turbulence with some of those winds that we see around the area below 4,000 feet is expected for that northwest coastline of the state. And then down in the Aleutian Islands below 3,000 feet by the western and central Aleutians, below 4,000 feet for the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, and then below 5,000 feet for southwest Alaska and Kodiak Island. Below 6,000 feet is expected for the Panhandle.
Happy Halloween, star partiers. Trace here, ready to take your money to cross the river Styx. But before we do that, let's learn about the story of a severed head in the sky. Around 10 p.m. all this Halloween week, look due east. There you'll see the bright star of Aldebaran, one of the brightest in the sky. It's part of Taurus. Far above Aldebaran, you'll see the W of Cassiopeia, and in between is the constellation Perseus, the ancient Greek hero who slew Medusa, the monster with snakes for hair that turned humans to stone with a look. Legend has it Algol was the star, marking Medusa's severed head. Perseus is holding Medusa's head to defeat Poseidon's sea monster Cetus, which is also in the sky, just on the other side of the moon right now. Hopefully they hold off on their battle until after all the kiddos get their candy under a Halloween full moon. Keep looking up.
The Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge is a refuge in Alaska. It's the third largest refuge in the National Wildlife Refuge system. North of Fairbanks, it's a vast ecosystem of wetlands. What drives this refuge are natural forces of fire, ice, and water.
The Yukon Flats has got a really interesting history. Back in the late 50s, early 1960s, there was a proposal to dam the Yukon River down by Rampart, which is downstream of the Yukon Flats. And it was a hydroelectric proposal. And so in order to assess the merits of that proposal, people got together because they were a little bit concerned about what the impacts might be on the Yukon Flats, the habitat, and all the people living within the Yukon Flats Refuge. There's quite a few people living within the refuge. We have 7 villages. So in order to figure out how special the Yukon Flats was, the Fish and Wildlife Service banded over 40,000 ducks within the Yukon Flats. And using the band return information, they found out that those ducks were using 45 of the 50 lower 48 states. They were using 7 foreign countries, and they were using most of the provinces over in Canada, as well as all the major flyways down in the lower 48. And so that identified that the Yukon Flats was a special breeding area, and that information, along with a lot of other public information that was gathered during that whole process, really ensured that the dam never did go in, and thus the habitat was preserved.
So what that did is it really highlighted the national importance of this area and how important conserving this particular area is for conserving many other natural areas in the lower 48 and even across the continent.
To protect the Yukon Flats Refuge because we have responsibility towards our future generations to leave land protected in the state that it is now. The Yukon Flats is a wild place. The ecosystem is intact and functioning, and you can't find that very many places in the rest of the U.S.
The Yukon Flats Refuge is among the most important places for ducks. So each spring, millions of ducks, and in addition to shorebirds and geese, raptors and loons, they all fly to the refuge to nest and rear their young. And the reason they are attracted to this area is because it has really enriched wetlands. There are lots of nutrients in the wetlands that provide a lot of food for the growing young.
We also have a lot of predator, prey species like bears and black bears, grizzly bears, wolves. We also have a lot of moose and fur bearers that use the refuge. So overall, there's just a great diversity of both upland, lowland, and migratory bird species that use the refuge.
Most people know the Flats as a duck nursery, and that was one of the main purposes that was designed for, but a lot of recent research over the last decade has really illustrated how important it is to a variety of native endemic fish species for subsistence and recreational and commercial fisheries throughout the entire Yukon River Basin and out to supporting commercial fisheries out to the Bering Sea as well. So it supports a variety of different whitefish and salmon species, the northern pike, a little bit of everything that people rely on as cultural identities, but also for subsistence resources and where people go to recreate and enjoy being outside.
The type of recreation that you're going to find on Yukon Flats Refuge is very primitive. And what that often does is it gives people a complete break from some of the stresses of today's world. There are no cell phone towers out there. There are no roads. There are no trails. So any type of recreation that people have is entirely natural. The lands and waters within the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge are open to the public to enjoy. And that's a really important tenet upon which the United States is built.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start with a look at our ice edge. Not a lot of change from what we saw yesterday. We do have cold enough air for some good ice growth. However, those winds are holding it at bay for now, so we do expect that when those winds start to calm down that we will see a lot more ice growth, and there is still the potential to fill in the Beaufort Sea in the next week or so. On Friday for the southeastern portion of the state, inside water, southerly winds 15 to 30 knots, strongest as we get up north in the Lynn Canal area. Out over the Gulf waters, west winds expected 15 in the eastern locations, getting up to a size 25 as we get further north in the Gulf waters. On Saturday in the inside waters, south-southeast winds 30 knots expected, seas 6 to 7 feet. Out over the Gulf eastern portion, southerly winds 35 knots, seas up to 15 feet. And then southwest winds 25 to 30 knots in the northern areas. For Friday for south central Alaska out over the Gulf waters, we're seeing outflow winds that are going to result in some north to northeast flow for the western portions, 25 knots, and then 20 to 25 knots out in the northern portions out of a west to northwest wind. Northerly winds 25 knots in Prince William Sound, north to northeast winds 20 to 30 knots in Cook Inlet, and then northeast 30 knots west of the Barren Islands. On Saturday, we're going to see all primarily northerly wind directions throughout the area. 15 to 20 knots in Cook Inlet, 25 to 30 knots around the Barren Islands. Northern portions of the Gulf, 20 to 25 knots, and then 15 knots in Prince William Sound. Friday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. Around Kodiak Island, northeast winds 35 to 40 knots, seas 11 to 12 feet. On the Bering side, we're going to see northeast winds 40 to 45 knots. And then on the Pacific side, south to southeast winds 20 to 35 knots, highest as we get closer towards the Kodiak Island area. Seas up to a size 22 feet, for our highest farther to the west. On Saturday, looking around Kodiak Island, northerly winds 20 to 25 knots expected. Out over the Bering Sea side, 25 to 30 knots out of a north to northeast direction. And staying out of that northerly direction on the Pacific side, 25 to 30 knots as well. For the Aleutian Islands, we're going to see north to northeast winds throughout all of the areas on Friday. Storm force winds up to as high as 50 knots, with seas up to as high as 27 feet near the eastern Aleutian Islands, dropping down as we move farther to the west, 45 knots by the central Aleutians, and then down as low as 25 knots by the western Aleutian Islands. On Saturday, flow becoming more east to northeast, 25 to 35 knots by the western Aleutians, 25 to 30 knots for the central Aleutians, and 35 to 40 knots for the eastern Aleutians. For the west coast on Friday, southern locations are all going to be northeasterly winds. Strongest south of Nunavik Island, 40 knots, 45 knots by Pribilof Islands, 25 knots north of the island. And then in the more northern locations, west to northwest winds, 15 knots expected. On Saturday, flow becoming much more northerly throughout the area, 25 knots up north, 20 to 25 knots around Nunavik Island, 15 knots by St. Matthew Island, and 25 knots by the Pribilof Islands. Along the Arctic coastline, southerly winds 15 to 25 knots expected, strongest farther to the west. Then going down the west coast of the state, west to northwest winds 25 to 35 knots till we get down by the Bering Strait area, dropping around to 15 knots. On Saturday, in the eastern portions of the Arctic coast, southwest winds 15 knots. Otherwhere, we're going to see northerly winds 20 to 25 knots along the northwest coast, picking up to 30 knots as we move down the west coast, and then 25 knots by the Bering Strait. Recap of tonight's weather. We do have a low pressure system out by the central Aleutian Islands with its front pushing through the Alaska Peninsula. This is bringing some stronger winds and rain to areas throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula, and now Kodiak Island. High pressure out over mainland Alaska will allow for fog to develop in the YK Delta area through the interior and up along the Arctic coastline, as well as the northern portions of Cook Inlet. We're going to see some snow from the Norton Sound area up the west coast towards Utqiagvik, and then in the eastern locations of the interior and south central Alaska. Down in the North Gulf Coast, we're going to see some rain and snow mix, rain at low-lying areas, snow at higher elevations, and then the northern locations of the Panhandle as well. For Friday, rain is going to start to spread throughout the Panhandle area as we'll have a series of storms coming up to the area, bringing heavy rainfall, especially on Saturday and Sunday, where we will see several inches of rain throughout the Panhandle area over that time frame. We're going to see primarily rain at low-lying areas and areas further to the south, but as we get further to the north, expecting that to transition over to snow in the higher elevations. Out over mainland Alaska, we're going to see some snow for the Norton Sound area, up the west coast and northern interior, as well as the Arctic coastline, where we'll see some fog as well. And then more rain throughout the Aleutian Islands, Alaska Peninsula, and Kodiak Island from our system near the eastern Aleutians. On Saturday, we're going to see continued rain for the Panhandle area, as well as snow spreading out through much of the interior, west coast, and Arctic coastline of mainland Alaska. Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.